What Zapffe understood is that human beings do not simply suffer from pain. They suffer from awareness, from knowing too much, seeing too far, and still being expected to live normally. That is why we cling to routines, why we feel silence so quickly, why we keep ourselves distracted, even when we are exhausted. Zappfe believed we survive this burden through 4 defenses. 4 ways of narrowing reality before it crushes us. 4 lies that keep us functioning. Wessel Zapffe was a Norwegian philosopher and writer who looked at human life with merciless clarity. He did not think our suffering came mainly from politics, bad luck, or some temporary crisis of meaning. He thought the problem ran deeper. He thought awareness itself had become a burden. That we had evolved far beyond what life could comfortably contain. That we were no longer just animals trying to survive, but creatures forced to reflect on survival, question it, doubt it, and suffer through that doubt. In other words, the wound was not just in the world, it was in us. And because awareness had gone too far, because the human mind could no longer simply live, but had to examine life, endure life, and somehow justify life, Zappfe believed we developed ways of protecting ourselves. The first of these defenses is what he called anchoring. Anchoring is what happens when we fasten ourselves to something solid enough to stop the mind from drifting too far. A belief, a family, a career, anything that gives life structure, weight, and direction. Anchoring tells us that our life belongs somewhere, that our suffering is part of something, that our days are moving toward some recognizable end, that there is a center holding everything together. And without that feeling, people begin to unravel, because once the mind loses its anchor, it starts drifting toward questions ordinary life cannot answer. So we anchor ourselves before the questions go too far. And most of the time, we do it so naturally, we hardly notice. One person says their children are the reason. Another says it's God. Another says it's duty. And maybe these things really do matter, but that is not the point. Zappfe's point is a bit darker. It is that the human mind may need these structures, not merely because they are beautiful or noble, but because without them, awareness becomes unstable. The anchor is not always false, but it is always functional. It holds the self together. It keeps life from spilling into chaos. It gives us somewhere to return before thought widens into terror. Think about how quickly people panic when an anchor is removed. When they lose the job they build themselves around. When a relationship ends and takes their identity with it. When faith collapses. When success no longer motivates them. When the future they trusted suddenly disappears. What falls apart in those moments is not just comfort. It is orientation. Because the anchor was doing more than giving meaning. It was keeping the abyss organized. That is why people cling so tightly to things that give them form. Not because they are foolish, not because they are naive, but because human beings seem unable to live for long, without some fixed point around which their life can turn. Without it, even ordinary existence begins to feel slippery. You wake up, you go through the motions, but the center is gone. And without a center, the mind starts to expand into places it was never meant to stay. This is the first lie. Not that life has no real structures, but that we relate to them innocently. Zappfe is suggesting something harsher, that often what we call meaning is also containment. What we call purpose is also protection. And what we call identity is in part a defense against the unbearable openness, being alive. And once you see that, anchoring stops looking like a spiritual act. It starts looking like a survival instinct. The second strategy is distraction. If anchoring gives the mind something stable to hold on to, distraction gives it something immediate to run toward. A task, a screen, a conversation, a schedule, anything that keeps awareness occupied. Because an occupied mind is easier to live with than an open one. and modern life is almost perfectly built for this. We wake up into stimulation. We carry it in our pockets. We sleep beside it. At any moment of stillness, there is something waiting to absorb our attention and shield us from the full force of our own inner life. And this is why distraction feels so natural now, not because we have become shallow, but because distraction works. It narrows awareness. It prevents certain thoughts from fully forming. It keeps dread fragmented. And from the outside, it looks normal, productive even, healthy. But Zapffe would ask a darker question. Functional for what? For life or for escape? Because there is a difference between living fully and being constantly preoccupied. We praise busyness, we reward responsiveness, we admire speed, engagement, and constant activity. But maybe some of that movement is not vitality. Maybe it is anesthesia. Maybe distraction has become so normalized that we no longer recognize it as a defense at all. We call it entertainment, or ambition, or staying informed. But beneath all those names lies the same function: to keep awareness from being too clear, to keep the deeper questions weak enough that they never fully take shape, to make sure that silence never lasts long enough to become dangerous. That is why boredom can feel so intense. It is rarely just boredom. It is often the first crack in the wall, the first sign that the distractions are no longer holding. And as soon as that happens, we rush to repair it. We turn something on, we reach for someone, we invent a task, we move, because movement is easier than exposure. And that brings us to the third strategy: isolation. If anchoring gives the mind a center, and distraction keeps it occupied, isolation does something colder. It pushes certain thoughts out of reach. It seals them off. Zappfe does not mean social isolation here. He means psychological isolation. The mind's ability to exclude dark and destabilizing truth before they spread. In simple terms, it is the ability to know something and yet not let it fully in. We do this constantly. We know we will die, but we rarely feel it. We know everyone we love is temporary, but we do not walk around shattered by that knowledge. We know our identities are fragile, our futures uncertain, and our routines artificial. And yet somehow we continue speaking, planning, posting, as if this knowledge were not sitting just beneath the surface at all times. That is isolation. The filtering out of what would otherwise become overwhelming. Because a human being felt everything they knew, all at once, would not remain stable for very long. So the mind selects, it excludes, it edits. It allows in only what can be handled. This is why certain truths appear only in flashes: a funeral, a sleepless night. Those strange moments when the wall thins and reality suddenly arrives with more force than usual. And then, just as quickly, the mind begins repairing itself. It returns to language, to routine, to plans, not because normality is fake, but because without some return to normality, the truth would remain too near. Isolation is what makes the return possible. It is the membrane between awareness and collapse. And then there is the fourth strategy, the strangest one: sublimation. Sometimes distraction fails. Sometimes isolation cracks. Sometimes the truth gets in, and when that happens, one last option remains: transform it. Sublimation is what happens when pain is turned to something higher, something shaped: art, philosophy, music. This is the most dignified of the four defenses. But Zappfe still sees it as a defense. That is what makes his view so unsettling. Even our highest creations may not be triumphs over suffering, but ways of containing it, ways of giving form to what would otherwise remain unbearable. A poet takes despair and turns it into rhythm. Something unbearable becomes beautiful, or at least bearable. But Zappfe refuses to let us romanticize it, because sublimation does not remove the wound. It works on the wound. It shapes it. But underneath the finished work, the original problem remains. Awareness is still too large. Life is still too fragile. Meaning is still too unstable. The abyss is still there, only now it has been given style. This is perhaps the cruel brilliance of Zapffe. He does not even spare human greatness. He looks at art, philosophy, religion, and the great monuments of inward life, and asks whether they are not, in part, sophisticated responses to a condition that cannot be cured. Not pure expressions of freedom, but elegant ways of surviving. Maybe that's why the greatest art always feels layered. It uplifts, but it also betrays a wound. It reveals beauty, but beauty under pressure. It gives form to life, but a form haunted by what it is trying to redeem. The greatest creators are not always the healthiest souls. They often walk close to madness, but they are also the ones who felt the pressure most intensely and somehow turned it into something the rest of us could look at without collapsing. That is sublimation, not the escape through forgetting, but escape through transformation. And with that, the pattern becomes harder to ignore. Anchoring gives us something to believe in. Distraction gives us something to do. Isolation keeps the worst truths at a distance. And sublimation turns suffering into something beautiful enough to endure. Together, they form a map of ordinary human life. Not just extreme cases. Not just philosophers and artists. Everyone. The family man anchored in duty. The worker distracted by constant busyness. The believer folding fear into ritual. Different lives, same machinery. And maybe that is the most unsettling part of Zapfe's philosophy. Not that human beings suffer. Not that life is fragile. Not even that death shadows everything we do. But that what we call a normal life may depend on never seeing too clearly. That sanity itself may require a certain blindness, a certain narrowing, a certain distance from the full weight of existence. Because if Zappfe is right, then these four defenses are not rare distortions. They are not weaknesses found only in the lost, the anxious, or the broken. They are everywhere. And once you see that, ordinary life starts to look different. The busy person is not just busy. The ambitious person is not just ambitious. All of them may be doing the same thing in different forms, protecting themselves from a truth too large to face directly, a truth that does not always arrive as despair. Sometimes it arrives as silence, as boredom, as restlessness, as a strange feeling in the middle of an otherwise normal day that something about life is far less solid than it appears. And maybe that is why Zappfe still feels so dangerous, because he does not let us keep our innocence. And that leaves us with a difficult question. If these defenses are illusions, can we live without them? Can a human being face existence completely naked, without anchoring, without distraction, without filtering? Zapphe's answer seems to be no. That is his tragedy. The human beings are not built for full honesty, that to see too clearly is to suffer, and to survive is, in some form, to look away. Enough to wake up tomorrow, enough to continue, enough to remain functional. And maybe that is what makes awareness such a strange burden. It does not destroy us all at once. It forces us into a lifetime of subtle negotiations with the truth, a lifetime of narrowing, a lifetime of filtering, a lifetime of trying to live inside a reality we were perhaps never meant to fully comprehend. So maybe the question is not whether we live by illusions. Maybe we do. Maybe the real question is which illusions preserve us, and which ones hollow us out. Because one way or another, we are all leaning on something. Something that keeps the silence from saying too much. Something that keeps the mind from going too far. Something that helps us to remain here, in this life, for one more day. And maybe that is all a human being has ever been. A creature too aware to live in peace, and too fragile to live without protection.